All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on all of the questions that you have on batting. What kind of batting should I use? Tell me all of the things about batting. I am Audrey Esarey. I'm your hostess for this evening, and I'm joined by Steph from Hobbs, one of the fantastic batting companies. Steph, will you also introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to say thank you for having me. This is super
Yeah.
exciting. For those of you who may not know, I am joining from Quilt Festival, which just opened about an hour and a half ago. They are having preview night tonight. I'm going to head down there after our session. But my name is Stephanie Hackney. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing for Hobbs Bonded Fibers. We are what's known as a non-woven textiles firm, and we are located in Waco, Texas. We make products not the same way that fabric companies do, in that we don't weave them like with a warp and a weft. We actually use loose components and then combine those together through a variety of processes. And the goal is to lock them together very tightly and give them high integrity so that when you put them in your quilts last. As history of the company, we've been in business since 1953, and we started making and batting in 1978. The Hobbs family had many quilters in the family, so it's always been a focus that whatever we make, we want it to be the very best quality so that your quilts hold up over time. I work in Waco. I actually live in Austin, Texas. So for anybody who's been there, but I go in usually 1 or 2 days a week and I'm on the road a lot. And the most fun part of my job is getting to do exactly what I'm doing here with Audrey, and that is educating people on batting. Because we find that the more people know about batting, the more different battings they want to try, and the better outcomes you have. So our goal tonight is to try to impart as much knowledge as possible. I'm always available as a resource. So even after this, Audrey's welcome to share my contact information. You're welcome to reach out to me if you have a question.
Yeah, and I actually had the pleasure of seeing Steph speak maybe 18 months ago. She gives a great lecture on all the different types of batting that Hobbs has. And I'm often asked what type of batting I use in my quilts. And so this idea of a webinar came up, and I thought this would be a great place to start and see if we can get some questions and answers for everybody on your most popular questions. So, Steph, if you're ready, I'm ready to start asking you some of these great questions.
Okay, great.
So a lot of my audience is interested in entering their quilts in quilt shows and having quilts that get packaged up, boxed up, folded, transported, hung. They're handled a lot. And we want our quilts to look best when they are hanging in those quilt shows after all of that shipping and handling. So what do you find is the best batting for quilts that will be used either as wall hangings or to be hung in quilt shows?
Okay, great question. So I think there's a few different things that you need to consider. Number one, you need to think about what it is that you want to emphasize in your quilt, right? Because if you have a whole cloth quilt, then your emphasis is really on your stitching. If you have a quilt that's very heavily pieced, you really want that piecing to show, but you don't want to overshadow it, right? So you need to always be thinking what it is that I want to stand out in my quilt and what do I want maybe to recede, because sometimes we want to sort of push some things in the background and some things forward. So that's the first thing to consider. The second thing is drapeability and how the quilt hangs, right? Judges are very picky about those kinds of things. They want your quilt to hang very straight, have very clean, squared up edges. And so there are some battings that are not as great for that as other battings. So we always want to think about the drape and the hang. We also want to think about the back of the quilt. And I think oftentimes that gets forgotten, right? People don't think about the back of a quilt. Just like if you make a garment, you may not give as much consideration to the inside of the garment, but it's really important if it's going to be judged. So you can pair battings, meaning you can take two different layers of batting and put them together and have a different finish to the back than you do to the top. So we'll talk a little bit about double batting as well. But the key thing is that you need to remember that most likely you're going to fold the quilt up, try to squish it into the smallest box possible so
Mhm.
your shipping isn't outrageous. And then it's going to sit like that. And it may sit like that for a while before it's judged. And then once it's judged, it's going to get folded back up. It's probably going to get put back in the container, and it may be stacked with lots of other quilts. Well, the more weight you have on a quilt when it's in that folded state, the more the creases are going to lock into the quilt. And for that reason, we recommend using wool batting. And the reason being is that wool batting does not have a memory for creases.
Mm.
So if you like a lofty finish, which is what the wool batting will give you, and there's sort of a caveat to that, so I'll talk about that. But if you really like a nice puffy finish, right? You want a lot of texture, a lot of dimension, then wool is a really, really nice choice. It is really the best way to show off your piecing and stitching and all that hard work you put into your quilt. But you also want to be thinking about different areas of the quilt, right? Well, a lot of times we see, like at the show right now, we see art quilts, and they
Mhm.
might have some areas that they want really lofty and some they want really flat, again, to make some things recede and some things stand out. You can still get that same finish with wool, because the more you quilt it, the flatter it's going to get. So I
Mm.
think that's important. Sometimes people don't realize that when they're using the wool, they just think it's automatically going to be puffy. Yes, it will be puffy, but it's going to puff between the stitch lines. If
Okay.
you really densely stitch it like thread painting, it is going to flatten and stiffen it. If anybody looks at our Instagram feed from Quilt Market, you will see some embroidered pieces. One of them has a horse. And if you zoom in on the picture, you'll notice that there's some areas that really puff and stand out, and there's some very flat, smooth areas. So you can achieve different textures and dimensions and focus points by using that wool batting and stitching it in different ways. Now, one thing I do want to
If
mention is
I
that
I want to cut in just for a second and
uh-huh,
ask. So, one thing that I found about wool batting is that it doesn't have that pure white shade. And so
correct.
when I have a quilt, if it has Kona snow or Kona white, if I press my seams open, when I, have that white fabric over the top of an off-white batting, it sometimes emphasizes those seams, or I get the brown specks of the fibers that come through my lighter colored fabrics. How do you mitigate that if you're using a wool batting? You want to use a wool batting so that you get a beautiful flat, no memory for creases quilt, but
Mhm.
then you want to use those lighter textiles. How do you deal with that?
So a couple things to think about. Number one, our wool and our cotton battings are washed. So you will not see any specks. If you're seeing specks, it's not a Hobbs batting
Okay.
because
Okay.
the fibers that we buy are pre-washed. The wool is a super washed wool, and it has a very different texture than most wools. It's, if you're thinking about, like, you have that old scratchy sweater that's in the back of the closet
Mhm.
that usually you forget about, then you put it on, then you remember why you don't wear it because it kind of
Right.
scratches.
Right.
This is not at all like that. This is more like a merino wool. It's got a very smooth surface to it. It's very, very smooth to the touch. Doesn't snag on your hands, even if your hands are dry. And I find that even with the lighter or white fabrics, it does just fine. Now, if you're concerned about that, especially if you have a thinner or a really bright white fabric and you want to keep that really, really white, you can use something like a polyester, which naturally has a lot of loft and it's very white. If anybody looks at our booth pictures from market, or if you've been around when we've had our banner hanging up, it is very white Kona cotton, like white, white, white. And
Okay.
we wanted it to stay really white. We put the polyester batting on the top, we put the silk on the back, and it's very white, and then it has those bright Kate facet fabrics in the corners, and then it has
Okay.
our name in the middle. But if you flip it over and look at the back, it's just as bright on the back, and the back is actually silk, and the silk is a natural color.
Right.
So keep in mind that what we recommend is, if you're concerned about that, test it, right? Take some of the fabric that you intend to use, put the battings in there, make a little mini quilt, wash it, hold it up to the light and take a look at it, because
Yeah.
you may or may not see any difference between using the white batting and using that more natural tone batting. But the nice thing is that the wool batting is not a dark, it's not like a dark yellow, right? It's
Right.
not It's a lighter version of that color. And frankly, I use it for a lot of things. And everybody here in Texas uses wool in their quilts because of the breathability.
Okay, okay. Now, what about, you mentioned briefly double batting. So I know that a lot of quilt makers, especially those that exhibit their work where you are at festival, will layer the bottom layer being wool and then the top layer is polyester. Is there could you do a layer of wool and then a thin layer of a white cotton if you were worried about that fabric showing through, just to get that nice white background of the batting?
You could. Now, normally when we recommend the wool and it's going to be paired with something, the wool is the top layer, right? So
Okay.
because if you put cotton, especially because cotton's a heavier fiber, if you put that on top of the wool, when you stitch, you're not getting that puffy benefit of the wool because the cotton is between your top of your fabric and your wool. You also need to understand a few things about cotton. Number one, cotton is a flatter, stiffer fiber, right? Most of our cottons are fairly thin. They've been heavily needle punched. And in the needle punching process, if somebody's ever done wool felting where you have a block and you take those real sharp needles, we do that same process when we make batting. Well, the more you needle punch a fiber, especially things like cotton, it's actually going to flatten and stiffen the fiber. Now, when you grab the batting, it's still cushy and soft and really nice, but it does do something to the fiber. If you then go over that cotton fiber very heavily with stitching, it is going to be stiff as a board. So we normally say if you're going to pair battings, you're going to put the cotton or a cotton blend in there and you want to put some wool, the wool goes on top. The cotton or the cotton blend is generally put on the back to give heft or weight to the quilt so that it drapes nicely, right? Because the wool is super lightweight and it's sort of floaty, right? And so to have that cotton on there, that adds some weight and it helps it drape. The other thing to note about cotton is that 100% cotton will crease heavily. So there's actually a couple quilts in the show right now that when we walked up to them, the first thing I noticed was how deeply creased they were. That has cotton batting in it. So that's another reason we recommend pairing the wool and the cotton. If you will put the wool in there with it, or even use our cotton wool blend with the wool on top, you will have far fewer creases. If you just use 100% cotton and that quilt is folded up for a long time, it's going to have deep creases when you hang it up.
Okay. And what about doing a double layer of batting with silk? What would you pair with silk, for example? I know you said there's a polyester in your booth, but would you ever put cotton and silk together?
We normally pair, like in our booth banner, we have a layer of polyester with a layer of silk underneath. So the polyester is on the top to give it the puff and the loft and the texture. The silk is on the back to give it the structure and drape. Now, something to understand about the silk. So you have the silk in the quilt behind you, right?
I do.
And it has a more structured feel to it. But once you wash whatever you've made with it, that silk relaxes and becomes the most buttery, drapey finish of anything we make. Normally, when we pair the silk, if the project is going to be washed, and this is important for any battings that you're going to pair, if you are going to wash the quilt or any project you make, the shrink rate must be the same on both battings. You don't want to put a shrinking and a non-shrinking batting together because here's what will happen. So here's the silk batting, here's the poly batting, right? The silk is going to shrink 3 to 5%. So when it shrinks, it's going to pull in on this polyester that's not going to shrink. That can cause twisting or distortion in your quilts. You have to be super careful when you do that. Now, in the case of our banner that hangs in our booth, we're not ever going to wash that, right? It's just going to hang up. And the reason we paired those two things was to, again, to get that puffin texture on the front, to get the nice stiff structured drape on the back, and they're both super light. I actually fold that up and hand carry that banner everywhere we go. So I don't ever check it in my luggage. I don't ship it. It's always with me. And so it needed to be something that was really, really lightweight that I could fold up pretty small and carry on the plane. And that when I popped it open, that it would release those creases. Now, it will still have a little bit of creasing in it, but it's really, really quick and easy to either steam press it or iron it. But just keep in mind that anytime you're pairing battings, you want to note the shrink rate, and that's on the charts that are on our website. It's on every single page where there's a product, and it's also on the packaging. And that's the same for every manufacturer. It's not just ours. You'll always get a recommended stitch guideline, and you'll always get a shrink rate.
Okay, great. All right, so you touched on washing of these quilts, and listen, I mean, we all know that these wool quilts are beautiful, they feel great, but people are terrified to wash them. How do you wash a quilt with the wool? It's the Tuscany wool batting, is that right?
Right.
How do you
So
how do you wash a wool
yeah, so
batting?
we make the wool batting in both the heirloom and the Tuscany line. And I'm going to tell you the difference between, because I think
Okay,
that's
great.
important to understand. But all of our battings are washable. Some of them will shrink, some of them don't. The polyester battings that are 100% polyester have no shrinkage. So if you want a really smooth finish to your quilt, those are a really great choice. All of our other battings are going to shrink 3 to 5%. One of our real thick cottons is 4 to 6%. They're all machine washable once inside a quilt.
Okay,
Please
yeah,
do not
we got some
ever
questions on
pre-wash batting.
pre-washing a batting. You would be surprised how many times that query, and it's in the chat now. So never pre-wash a batting. Is that what I'm
No.
hearing?
And
Okay,
here's why. Remember I mentioned earlier that it's not woven like fabric, right?
right.
So let's take our 80-20 for an example. 80% cotton, 20% poly, or 20% wool, and we blend those fibers together. We throw them in a hopper, they start to blend up, they go through a variety of different processes on our equipment, and our goal is to take those loose fibers and lock them together like this. We don't want them to pull apart. Our goal is high integrity in the batting so the quilts last and you don't get migration and lumps of batting. When you pre-wash a batting, this is what you're doing. You're actually loosening all that work we just did, and we can no longer guarantee the integrity of the batting. So please don't ever pre-wash your batting. If you are going to pre-wash your fabrics and you want a smooth finish, right? You don't want any shrinkage or wrinkling. You like a really smooth, maybe a more modern look. Then your only choice would be to use a poly batting that doesn't shrink, because everything else will shrink. When it shrinks, it pulls in and it wrinkles and wrinkles the fabric, giving a very traditional look.
Okay. So we're at, we get our prepackaged batting and we're excited. We take it out of the package, and then we're looking at it and we say, wait a second, is there a right or wrong side to this thing? And sometimes we Google it and sometimes we guess. And then, I have my little tricks that I look for of how to identify the right or wrong side, but let's hear it from the experts. What is the right and wrong side for the batting?
Okay. For Hobbs batting, there is no right or wrong side. The battings are made to look the same on both sides. Now, I will tell you, the needles go in one direction, right? So when you look at a piece of batting, if you pick up a piece of batting like this, you may see a little marks, right, where the needles have gone in to punch the fiber. And it may look a little more in on one side and out on the other, but essentially the battings are made to be the same on both sides. So you do not need to worry about that. You don't have to flip it over back and forth and try to figure that out. Now we have one product that's different, and that is the heirloom natural cotton with scrim. The scrim layer is only on one side. So we take a layer of cotton, we put a layer of scrim on the back, and then we needle punch the two together to lock the fibers together. You have to really work at getting those back apart. And you're not supposed to take them apart, but when I demo in a live lecture, I will actually pull them apart so people can see that there's actually two different things being attached here. With that product, we recommend putting the scrim down. It's personal choice. You can try it both ways, but most people use the scrim facing down.
Okay, so we did get some questions about scrim, and one person actually wrote, tell me all about scrim. What is it and when would I want it? And then that leads into questions about the little pokies that we get through the back of our quilt, which some of us call bearding. So can we spend a couple minutes and, talk about scrim? What is it? Why do we want it? Why would we not want it? I hear it's only offered on one of the products. So tell us all the things about scrim.
Okay, so first of all, scrim is your best friend if you like cotton batting. At least if you like to use our cotton battings, which tend to be thinner, they're going to be very, very soft. And you need to be very careful anytime you're handling 100% cotton batting. This doesn't matter if it's ours or someone else's. When it's just 100% cotton and you don't have any other fiber blended into it or any scrim, it is going to be delicate. So when you pick it up, you don't want to pull on it. You don't want to tug on the roll. You want to keep it, you know, very smooth. If you're loading a long arm with a big roll, you don't want to grab the outer corners and yank on it because you'll get little bunny ears and it'll be all wavy. Think about it like a cotton ball. If you take a cotton ball and you start to pull on it, you'll stretch it out of shape. If you continue to pull on it, you can actually pull it apart. And the same thing is with 100% cotton batting. Again, any 100% cotton batting. So when you're handling cotton, you just need to be a little more careful. Here's the trick with the scrim. That scrim is like a stabilizer or an interfacing. So if you've ever used any of those products and you've held them, you know they're really, really strong, and they're very thin. And this one that we use is extremely sheer and really, really soft. Even though it's a poly scrim, it feels very, very soft like the cotton, and you can tug on it and nothing happens. When you handle that batting, and again, I don't recommend this, but if you handle that batting and you do this, nothing happens to that cotton because that scrim creates a web or a net around the cotton and holds it in place. So why is that important? Well, if you're making something like a whole cloth quilt that you're going to manipulate a lot, you want to make sure that you've got a strong enough batting that'll hold up to that. You can stitch the daylights out of that batting over and over again. Now, again, it's going to get a little stiff when you first do it because it's already been needle punched. And if you lay a lot of thread on it, it's like a second needle punching, right? So once you wash it, it'll soften up a little bit. We do have a thicker cotton that actually you can heavily stitch and it will not get stiff in that same way. But that scrim really, if you like cotton, that to me is the best batting out there because it has that scrim layer that really protects the cotton. And you can go 8 inches apart on your stitches. So every batting has a stitch width. Being able to go wider than 4 or 6 inches up to 8 inches gives you more design options, right? It means you don't have to stitch in as many places. So it's really, really nice for that. As for the bearding, okay, that's what, if people call it pokies, we call it bearding. And what that means is if this were your quilt, you could have little tufts. Let me hold this up. You could have little tufts of batting coming out the top or out the back. And we get a lot of questions about that. It is generally not going to be a batting issue. If you're using a really poor quality product, it could be. Here are the things that we recommend to prevent bearding and then how to fix it. So number one, start with the best quality fabric. If you're using Kona cottons or other quilt shop level fabrics, $10, $12, $15 a yard, you should never have an issue because of the fabric. But if you start with a really inexpensive fabric and when you hold it up, right, you can see through see light through it, you're probably going to have a bearding issue either while you're quilting or once you wash the quilt. So if you'll start with really good fabric, that solves 50% of the problems. The second thing is to change your needle often. Anytime you're starting a new quilt, start with a new needle. You want to make sure it's very sharp and that when you run your fingers down it, there's no nicks or burrs in it. If there is a nick or a burr every time the needle goes in, it acts like a fish hook and it's going to pull batting up or push batting out the back. So it's very, very important that you always have a very sharp needle. Now, I will tell you on my domestic machines, when my needle starts to get dull, I can hear it in my machine, right? Instead of it going, it sort of goes clunk, 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 right? You can tell that it's having to work really hard to get that needle through all those layers. So if you start to hear a change in your machine, check your needle. Now we get a lot of pushback on that, right? People say, oh, I'm not going to put a new needle in. Here's the thing. You are going to spend a lot of time and maybe a lot of money on your quilt. The needle is the least expensive component of your quilt, and it should be thought of as a component of your quilt. You can get a beautiful pack of Schmetz needles or some of the other needles on the market. Superior makes them too, and they are about $1.50 each. right?
Yeah.
So think about all the money you're going to spend and your time. If you don't want to deal with bearding issues or skip stitches or snap threads or nested threads, then we recommend you make sure you've got really good needles and that you have a sharp one. People ask, how often do you have to change it? I can't tell you that because it depends on the quilt, it depends on the fabrics, it depends on how densely you're quilting, how fast you're quilting, your machine. I mean, there's lots of things. Again, check it often. You may make a quilt the size of the one behind you and use one needle. You may need 3 needles. Depends on how much thread you're laying into that quilt, how much quilting you're doing, how many seams you have. If you have a lot of seams, that's more fabric the needles are going through. If you're using different threads, if you have double batting, again, your needle will dull more quickly. So new needle is really, really important. And then of course, a really good quality batting. We make 14 different kinds of batting. Our competitors make nice battings as well. So what I want to offer is, let's say that you've done all those things. You've done everything right. You start to quilt your quilt and you start to have bearding. The most important thing is that you want to stop and fix the problem. You cannot wash bearding out of a quilt. Once a quilt beards, it will always beard. And when you wash it, it's actually going to get worse. So you have 2 options. You can stop and fix the problem right away or keep going, and then you'll need to shave all the bearding off and then dry clean your quilt from that point on. Because anytime you wash it, it will beard some more.
Okay.
So let's say that it starts bearding and you think, oh, I've done everything right. First thing you're going to do is stop, take your needle out, put another new needle in. Eliminate that as a possibility. Maybe that needle isn't absolutely perfect and it's snagging the batting as it goes in. Start quilting again. If you're still having a problem, take your needle out and go down 1 size, because it could be that that particular combination of fabrics and batting, thread, tension, whether or not it's a full moon, right? For some reason, your needle is making too big of a hole and it's allowing batting to get pushed out the back or pulled back up through on the top. So eliminate that as a possibility. Go down 1 size in your needle, start to quilt again. If you're still having an issue, check the tension on your thread, because it may be that the tension is too tight. It's pulling on the weave of the fabric, allowing a gap. And again, you can get some batting coming up through. And then finally, check your pairing of your thread and your needle, because certain needles are meant to be used with certain size threads. And if your thread is too big for your needle, so let's say on a long arm machine, this is your long arm needle, and you have this groove here that your thread is supposed to lay in there, not lay on top. Right. If the thread is too big, it lays on top. And as it goes into the fabric, it helps create the hole. You'll usually hear a popping sound, and the thread will act like a conveyor belt for batting. It's going to pull it back and forth with the needle. So that's another thing. You can try going, a little bit smaller on your thread and see if that makes a difference, or go a little larger on your needle. If you've already gone smaller on your needle, change your thread, not your needle. Right?
So yeah, these are good points. And I'm a long arm user. I have an APQS machine, and so the needle that I use with my long arm is really big in comparison to my 8012 Microtex sharp jeans denim needle that I use for piecing. And so that's definitely something that is a consideration. And then also the backing fabric. I've seen quilts that have these tight weave backing fabrics, like a batik or a lawn, or some of the tighter weave fabrics that I use for hand dyes, broadcloths. And, you do definitely feel a little bit, I feel less secure using that big needle with those tighter weave fabrics, because I'm afraid to damage the fiber. Instead of the needle passing through the woven fiber, I'm poking a hole or breaking the fibers. And so those are things to consider as well. When you have that type of reaction, you can't always go smaller with a long arm needle, because the long arm machine is so powerful that it doesn't always like that smaller needle, right? So
exactly.
I don't know if you feel this way, but as a maker, it's sometimes kind of, you have to pick which thing you want to try to manipulate and navigate to get the desired result. if you can't change your thread because you've already either started with that thread, or that's the manufacturer that has your color or finish, or that's the thread that your machine, like sometimes we have to think about all the other possibilities, right?
Exactly, exactly. And I think it's important to note that things like batiks, they're beautiful, right? Beautiful fabrics. And we provide the batting for the Island Batik Ambassador team. And we send them lots of different battings to try, and I always ask for feedback. Well, the batiks are very dense, right? They're very, very tight weave. So that is a little bit different. That also contributes to the feel of your quilt and the drape of your quilt. So I think then it's really important to consider what your batting is going to be. Because if you have a fabric that's more dense like that, a stiffer weave, you want to make sure that you don't put a batting in that's going to make that even more pronounced. Also, if instead of a backing fabric, you use a sheet, which we don't recommend, but we know people do it. And if you're trying to save some money and you're going to use a sheet, please use something that's at least 300 thread count. 400 or 600 is even better, but don't go any lower than that on the thread count, because the weave is not tight enough to hold batting in. And again, you may not get any bearding while you're quilting. And the first time you put it in the wash, all of a sudden you've got problems. And that could be from that particular fabric, right? So anytime you're going to use something that's sort of out of the norm for you, do a little quilt sample, right? A little mini version of what you're going to make. Try it out, throw it in the washer and dryer to see what it's going to look like, so that you don't end up disappointed after you've spent a lot of time and maybe money on a big quilt and it doesn't turn out the way you thought it would.
Yeah. This is so good. I have so many questions flying through my mind right now. One that's maybe a little bit more abstract to describe. Sometimes when you have this have a quilt and it's quilted, and then suddenly after unfolding it or after it comes out of the wash, you feel like parts of the fabric or the batting has like collapsed inside, and there are indentations in the quilt that are really visible, but it's not directly on a fold line. Maybe from the way that the quilting was applied, it pulled the fabric in a certain direction that pulled the batting. Have you ever seen anything like that, where there seems to be some like the memory indentations of the quilt that just won't seem to go away no matter if you press it or anything like that?
I have not had that experience, and I've not had anybody ask me about it. So that's a, if you ever see one of those, please send me a picture or a
I
video
will.
because I'd love to
I
see it.
will for sure.
But I think, we have a lot of really amazing custom long armors that we work with. And I could certainly ask them and then, follow up with you, and we could maybe post something about that.
Yeah.
I've not ever seen that happen. And again, I think that if you're using really good fabric, really good batting, it should not be a common thing. In 7 years, I've never had that question or anybody mention it.
Okay.
But if you
Good.
do have it happen, I would
I
love to see a
haven't on my
picture.
quilts, but I've walked around the show, the different show floors, and I've seen it's like the fabric I can see is being pulled, and I didn't know if something was happening inside the quilt that, with the batting that made things just not want to do what it needed to do. So I was just
Well, and I will tell you that we do get questions, and this is probably an important thing to bring up. We do get questions about what do you do if you've got puckers in the top, right?
okay.
So you finish your quilt top and it's not squared up and you've got kind of these funky spaces. The best thing you can do if you don't long arm is find the very best long armor, because those people are miracle workers, right? They can quilt it so that they can hide things that are mistakes, right?
Yeah.
One thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to do anything like that, let's say you're making a quilt as you go, like I've had some experience with like Baltimore quilts, and the person had put all the quilt blocks together, and the bottom two, the last two they put together, didn't line up well. They were kind of disjointed. And she called a friend, and her friend said, oh, just get your iron out, put some water in it, get it really hot and steamy, and then steam press the blocks into submission, right? Well, that worked great. Here's the problem. She already had the batting behind it, and it was wool batting. And it immediately felted the wool. And when wool felts, it will beard, it gets rigid and stiff. So think about it. If you've ever taken a wool sweater and accidentally put it in the washing machine, it shrinks like Barbie clothes. It becomes really, really dense, no longer nice. That batting is ruined.
Yeah.
So in the case where we had somebody who did that, what we had her do was to just open those last two blocks up, remove the batting piece, a new piece in there. But anytime that you're going to be applying high heat and steam with ironing to square up blocks, do it before you put the batting in, or definitely don't do it with wool, cotton wool, or silk batting, because you will ruin those battings by applying high heat and steam.
Okay, so we actually did get a question from Darlene in the chat that says, is there a problem with ironing a quilt if wool is used as trapunto as an example? So how would you recommend? Just go with a lower heat on your iron if you have to ease out some of those wrinkles?
Yes, yes, you definitely want to be very, very careful, because again, high heat and steam, hot water, all those things will actually felt the wool right through the fabric. The same thing if you have like a show quilt and you're going to take it to a dry cleaner because it's valuable and you don't want to put it in the washing machine. Make sure you have a label on the quilt. Make sure it says on there wool batting inside. Make sure it says, delicate cleaning, delicate wash, and then make sure you talk to the people when you drop it off and make sure they understand there's wool in there, right? Because even if they don't use chemicals, they probably use high heat and steam in the dry cleaning process.
Right.
And if you've ever had any kind of shiny material, if you put high heat and steam, it gets glossy, right? Well, you get that high heat and steam on a wool batting, and again, it's going to felt it through the fabric and ruin it.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about thread and batting combinations, because I know that some thread and batting combinations just are not compatible. So I'll give you an example of one and you tell me if this is true or not. So cotton thread and wool batting, I've heard, are a bad combination because the cotton thread won't stand up to the wash. If you need to wash that quilt, the cotton thread is more likely to snap than a polyester thread. Is that true?
No.
No. Okay.
Not in my experience, because we have a lot of designers who use our wool batting who are like aura philosophers, and they use all cotton thread.
Okay.
Right. And so I will start by saying, number one, I am not an expert on thread.
Okay.
There are lots of people who are experts on thread. That's not me. But I will tell you, there's a lot of misinformation around thread, right? People have said often, well, you should never use a polyester thread with cotton fabric because the polyester in the thread is stronger than the cotton fabric.
Right.
Lots of people do it every day. Right?
I do it.
Yeah. And so that's why I think it's really important. Maybe you want to invite one of the thread companies to do a lecture, because each of them have very specific things they'll tell you about their threads, when to use them, when not to use them. But I can tell you, we have many quilts that have been made with all cotton thread or a cotton collie mix with the wool, with every batting that we make.
Okay.
I will say most of the time, if people are making things like charity quilts or baby quilts, kids quilts, what really high use quilts, right? Everyday utility quilts, a lot of times they'll use poly thread because it holds up better over a long period of time, especially if the quilt's being pulled on. But if you wash your quilts very delicately, which is what we recommend cold water, delicate wash, limit the agitation and spin, and then put them in a cool dryer or air dry them, you will find that your quilts will last a lot longer and you shouldn't have any problems. If you're using high quality thread, right? So you've got lots of different options there. You should never have a problem with the thread breaking, right?
Okay, so
but
you're not aware of there's no known pairings of thread to batting that are absolutely disastrous. Is that what you're saying?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
But if you have somebody from the thread companies, and I will ask all my counterparts at the thread companies about that, because I would like to know as well. But I've not had that experience. We work with lots of people that use all different kinds of thread and batting. And I've not ever had anybody tell me it's an issue. If there's anybody who knows for sure, who's maybe a, brand ambassador for a thread company and they know, it'd be great to know.
I think I might know a couple aura philosophers that I could coordinate y'all tell me after this webinar if this was helpful, if you'd be interested in something going forward, a series like this, and I would be happy to coordinate a session with someone from Auraphil if I could find somebody. So so that's great to know that there's no kind of like disastrous combinations between thread and batting. I personally have really enjoyed using silk batting recently. This quilt, my Aura #7 quilt, I used silk batting in it. It just quilts so nice. I can't even tell you how nice it quilts. And I did quilt that with a 40 weight polyester thread. And it went really well. So I'm kind of looking forward to using more silk batting in my quilts. But I do wonder if there are any watch outs. And we did have a question in the chat that talked about there are some older quilts that she's found where the silk fibers are falling apart. And is that still a concern with the way that Hobbs creates their silk battings?
Is it silk fibers in the fabric or in the batting? So if she could clarify that, that might help.
Yeah, that's quite a question from Janet Wilson. Janet, if you want to clarify that, I'm most concerned about the silk fibers inside the batting and the strength of those fibers and the longevity of the quilts. So could you talk, a little bit about the silk batting and what's the best? I mean, I'm using it for wall hangings, but certainly are there types of quilting activities that the silk batting is best used for?
So to start with, the silk is 90% raw silk, okay? And it is blended with 10% poly. So again, like the 80-20, it's those fibers are blended together and they're locked together. The 90% silk has quite a bit of strength to it, but we add the poly in there for two reasons. Number one, it's going to give strength and durability. And secondly, it's also going to give it a little bit more loft because the silk is fairly flat, or what we call low loft. So we add the poly in there to give it a little bit more puff. It is beautiful for making your stitching stand out. And if you're going to be doing thread painting and you want something that's really going to hold up to that, the silk is a nice batting for that. It is my #1 recommendation for clothing. If you're making jackets and coats and things, and you want them to really hug your body and be very flattering instead of more boxy and structured, that is the batting that we recommend. And it's really wonderful because it breathes, it's a natural fiber, and it will be great in all climates. Here in Texas, we primarily use wool and the silk because it's very, very hot here, and then it can get extremely cold. And so it's really nice to be used year round. The silk is also fantastic for things like wall quilts and art quilts. The reason we like it for art quilts is oftentimes those have a lot of tiny details. You don't want too much puff between your stitches, because let's say that this is the puff and then these are the stitch lines here. If you have too much puff here, it will sort of cover where that stitch line is, and it may obscure the work that you've worked really hard on. So we tend to use a lower loft batting for those kinds of quilts. But again, depends on what you're going for. It may be that you lay a ton of thread in one area to flatten wool out and let the wool puff in other areas. And again, that horse quilt that we put, it's a wall hanging that's on our Instagram feed. It was from our market booth. That's a really great example where you can zoom in and look at it, and you'll notice there's really flat, dense spots where thread painting was done, and then really puffy things. The same thing can be done with the silk. So it's a really, really nice batting for a lot of things. Normally, we recommend a very flat or low loft batting for anything for the table, right? Table runner, placemats, coasters. And the reason being, if you put a tall stem glass or something on there, it's very easy to knock it over if you've got a lot of puff. But you want to be very careful using silk If there's going to be food and drink around it, I don't recommend it, because you're not going to be able to wash that in warm water to get stains out of the fabric, which might be required in order to fully get the stain out. You have to wash things that are made with that batting in cold water on a delicate cycle. And then you need to either air dry it or dry it on a delicate setting.
Right. So this was one of the questions we had. What about quilting with very dense lines, like 1/8 of an inch apart? It sounds like silk would be a great option for that.
Beautiful, beautiful for matchstick quilting. Yes.
Okay, excellent. And then what about, on the packaging, it says quilt up to 4 inches apart. And so, one might think, well, does that mean that I can quilt the entire quilt with parallel lines 4 inches apart? Or do I have to create kind of like a 4-inch box where there is, and then make that a grid instead of just parallel lines? So, is it okay to do that for maybe, say, your 80/20? Is 80/20 your most popular batting sold?
It
The Hobbs
is. Yeah,
80/20?
the heirloom 80/20 is still our #1 selling batting. So here's some thoughts on that. It depends on the batting. Every batting, whether it's ours or another manufacturer's, will always have a stitch guideline. And if you go to the Hobbs Batting website, hobbsbatting.com, and you go to the product page, if you scroll down on that main page, there is a chart there. And there is a column called maximum distance between stitches. That information's also on every product page. It's on the packaging. You want to make sure you're following that. That is the stitch guideline that we have given based on testing the batting when we developed it, to know the batting will hold its integrity and remain sturdy and durable. If you go wider than that, you are risking the longevity of your quilt, right? And if you look at some of the old quilts, especially ones that were tied, you have lots of bunches of batting. That's usually because they were not anchored in enough places, and that's especially true with a tied quilt. So most battings are going to be every 4 inches. That is in each direction. But here's the thing. If you're making something with the 80/20 batting that has a lot of the poly, or you're using the scrim, right? That scrim is very strong. It's holding that cotton batting in place. You have a little bit more leeway. And with the scrim, you can go up to 8 inches apart. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to make squares, right? It could be diagonal. I just had somebody call me because they were putting a 4-inch border on their quilt, and they wanted to know, in that 4-inch border, can I just like stitch in the ditch at the top of it and then on that outer edge, or do I need to put something in the middle? My recommendation, because it was a kid's quilt, and I know those get a lot of loving, maybe a lot of abuse, I recommended that she put some stitching in the middle. And it could be, it could be like angled lines, whatever it's going to be. It could be, a very simple swooping pattern through it. Understand, the more places you anchor the batting, the less chance that batting's ever going to move. But the guidelines that we have given you is based on us testing the batting when we created it, and we highly recommend people follow it. I will tell you, in all the lectures I've ever done, probably 700 lectures in my 7 years, the majority of people either don't know that there's a stitch guideline or they don't follow it.
Okay.
And just as a reminder, you are risking the integrity of your quilt if you don't follow that guideline.
Right. So, I mean, I can definitely speak for myself and say I have lots of weird sizes and shapes of batting scraps that I have around my studio, and I use them for a lot of different things. But if, it's, I guess, a 2-part question. What are the best ways to use those scraps? And then, can you tell us, like, what's the best way to do a Franken batting where you're kind of connecting different pieces together? So help us use our batting scraps. How do we do that?
Great question. And I hope everybody's keeping them and using them, because it's really a shame to just throw them out. There's lots of other uses besides putting them in a quilt. So first of all, what's called Franken batting is taking 2 pieces of batting and joining them. So if this was a piece of batting and this was a piece of batting, you just want a really nice clean edge. You want to put them side by side, don't overlap, because if you overlap, you're going to get a lump where they cross each other. You want to just put them side by side and then run a zigzag stitch across. Okay, so once you do that, that locks those two pieces together. When you put them in the quilt, you're still going to be stitching your quilt, right? So you don't need to do any more than that. Now there is tape that's about an inch wide. That is a poly tape that you can lay on and you can iron it in place. That also works. I don't find it necessary. My whole team, we use the zigzag method. But you can use the tape if you're more comfortable with it. It comes in a white, it now comes in a black as well. Two things to note about it. Number one, it is poly. Don't put your iron directly on it, right? You want to use a pressing sheet. Secondly, we don't recommend it where you have high loft. So if you have puff and you have puff, right? And you want this puff, if you put a piece of tape in the pieces of scraps that are underneath, where that puff is supposed to be really puffy, it's not going to puff in the same way. That could give you that phenomenon you mentioned earlier, right? Where you have kind of this weird kind of flat spot. So if you're using a high loft batting, we recommend only using the stitch method. Stitch it together. And don't like go over and over and over it. Just do it one time. All you're trying to do is lay the batting to hold it together until you can do your quilting.
Great. What are some of the other ways that we can use our batting scraps?
So 80-20, if you cut it, a lot of times when you make a quilt, you'll have these strips down the end, right?
Yep.
So cut it the same size as your Swiffer and use that as your Swiffer pads. You can use it 1 or 2 times and then toss them. Again, you don't want to wash them because batting should never be washed on its own. It'll kind of get funky when you do that. But they're really good for that. Another thing is is actually a quilter gave me this input. She keeps a jar, like a mason jar, on her table. And when she has those little teeny tiny batting scraps that really are kind of a pain to connect together, she keeps them in there and she uses them as an eraser to take marks off her quilt top. So if you're using a pencil and you mark it, you need to kind of erase it off, you can wad up the batting, or wadding, they call it overseas, and then use it like an eraser. So it can be used for that as well. It's fantastic for great projects that maybe for gifts, right? If you're making little pouches, if you're making bookmarks, if you're making, I don't know, all sorts of little gift items, right? It's really, really good to save them for that. That way you don't have to cut up a big bat that you might be able to use in a quilt. Key thing to know when you are joining bats, anytime that you're pairing battings. Remember, we talked about layering battings, how the shrink rate needs to be the same. It's the same thing when you piece batting. So if you're going to put a bunch of different battings together, first of all, they should be the same loft, unless you want to arty, kind of quilt that's all kind of different lofts. But they should be the same loft and they should have the same shrink rate. You don't want to piece a bunch of non-shrinking and shrinking battings together, because they're going to pull at different places and that could result in a really bad outcome.
Great. I think we have time for 2 more questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
This has been so informative. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
So my second to last question is, when we're pin basting or spray basting a quilt, I know that the spray basting has become quite popular because it's a way to smooth things out and not have to work around all of those safety pins or put in all those safety pins. Does Hobbs have a point of view or an opinion on how that might affect the washability, quiltability, longevity of a quilt doing a spray basting versus a pin basting?
Well, we actually make a product called Heirloom 80-20 Fusible. So it is a fusible version of our 80-20. And basically, if this was the 80-20 batting, we spray a non-toxic water-soluble fusing medium on both sides. So that messy, smelly work that you do at home, you don't have to do that anymore. You can use that fusible. And what you do is you lay your back fabric, the fusible batting, and then your top fabric. You're going to get your iron really, really hot. You don't want any water in it, no steam, because it is a water soluble fusing medium. And if you get it wet, it won't stick. So you go into a corner to determine how long you're going to need to press it. You're going to press, I recommend 3 to 5 seconds. Lift your iron and let this completely cool. Once it's cool, tug on the fabric. It should adhere all 3 layers in one step. If it didn't, you may need a little bit more time. Key things are, very hot, dry iron, and you are pressing. You'll see a lot of demos. There's a lot of people that love this product, but when they demo, they tend to talk and move the iron back and forth. You don't want to move the iron because you need concentrated heat. So make sure that you're pressing each area. You can use things like the heat presses, right? If anybody has one of those, if they do like t-shirts and they press the vinyl on, you can use a heat press, you can use an iron. You'll just have to test out whatever you have to see how long it takes. I have never had it take more than 5 seconds. Usually 3 seconds is plenty. I use the Aliso mini iron most of the time, and I don't even put it on 3. I put it on 2 and I press 3 seconds. It's plenty to heat that in place. The nice thing about that is when you're done and you quilt your quilt, you still have to do your stitching. You're going to bind it, you're going to wash it. That fusing medium washes out. Okay, and once that fusing medium washes out, you're left with the really soft 80-20. You don't have that sticky feel or that rigid feel. Again, it's non-toxic, so it's not going to be an issue. Sometimes people get freaked out about putting that like in a baby or kid's blanket. It washes out and it's non-toxic. If you don't wash your project, so if you had made the quilt that's behind you with that batting, it's going to have a little more stiffness and structure to it, but it you know, because you're not washing it. In terms of spray basting, we have lots of designers that spray baste. We have a lot of them. Krista Watson's a great example. You know, she spray based all of our battings, no problem.
Okay.
So we've never had a problem. I would say probably the only one I might be a little, not leery, but I'd be more careful would be the wool.
Okay, great. And the last question that we'll close out with is related to our environmentally friendly processes and eco-friendly battings. So, you know, if certainly you could share any information on that topic or what Hobbs is doing to be a little bit more environmentally friendly, we'd love to hear that. And, you know, just be aware of what we're talking about. So that'd be great if you could share that.
Yeah, so I think one of the really important things to understand is that we try to recycle product in the manufacturing process. So there's always going to be a scrap piece that comes off the line, right? So we have these really big wide rollers, and you're always going to have a little strip piece that comes off, that gets cut off to give you really nice clean edges on the rolls and the bats. We take that product and we put it back in. So we don't dump it, right? We're not taking that to the dump and, you know, filling our landfills with that. We make lots of other kinds of products. So we make automotive and industrial products and even products for the equine industry to wrap horses' shins. And we recycle lots of products into other products. And it may be that it's a product that's made partly with like the scraps from a jeans factory, right? And then we might throw some of our scraps in there as well. Some products, doesn't matter what the fiber is, it's used for insulation, for sound, or for something else. And so we're able to recycle products. That's the first thing. Right. Secondly, we buy our wool and our cotton in the US. So it's not being shipped from overseas. We can control how it's presented to us. We make sure it's really, really clean, and it comes from local suppliers. So it's not being shipped from overseas, creating a larger carbon footprint. It also comes to us from a fairly close distance. So that's something I think that's important to note. I would say in terms of the batting itself, again, if you're reusing scraps, if you're you know, not throwing those things away, then you're also helping us. But I think, you know, there's a lot of misinformation out there. I think everybody should do their own research on products and processes. We get asked a lot about bamboo and whether or not we will make it and why we don't make it. We do not make any products with bamboo. I'm not knocking bamboo. There's some beautiful bamboo products out there, and I know lots of people that really love bamboo batting. We choose not to make one. I think the key thing with bamboo batting is that you need to look at what it's blended with, right? So there's usually, it's going to be cotton or rayon or tencel. You need to know how those fibers behave. In that full lecture that I give, I go into great detail about fibers and the characteristics of every fiber. So if anyone's interested in that, I give that regularly. You can reach out to me and I'll give you a link to where we're going to do one of those. And you were on one of those lectures, so you know I talk very in depth about fiber, and I always say, you know, now you've learned about cotton, or now you've learned about poly. So when you go to buy products that have those fibers in them, you have a lot of information at your disposal.
That's great. All right, Steph, we're going to wrap up. I can't believe it's been an hour. It flew right by. So one last question. Where's the best place to find the great Hobbs products that you've been talking about this evening?
Okay, so we sell our products through every major distributor in the quilting industry, and that includes distributors overseas and in Canada as well. So if you are looking for it, you can call us. Generally, we don't know specifically which stores have it because we sell it to the distributors and then they sell it to the retail stores. However, if you know what you want and you can give us your zip code or where you live, we can always try to track down a retailer through one of those distributors. We do have some large retailers who also function as distributors. Some of them offer business pricing in addition to retail pricing. So if you're a long armor, if you're in the business, we can refer you to one of them as well. We do sell wholesale only, so you unfortunately can't drive to Waco and visit Magnolia and then come buy your batting from us unless you're in business. Now, if you're a professional long armor, or you are interested in our charity batting program, that's something else we offer, then you'll be able to come and get your batting directly from us. So lots of different places. What I tell people, if you don't have a local store, if they don't carry the batting, if they buy from any distributor, you can get them to order it for you. Hopefully they will. And if not, you can type the product name into Google and you will see everybody who sells it. It's sold on Etsy, it's sold on Amazon. We do have some products in one big box store, but primarily it's going out through distributors and then into the independent quilt shops.
And we love our local quilt shops. So definitely that's my first place that I always try to look.
Yes.
So wonderful. Well, thank you again. This has been such a fantastic hour full of information around batting. And to those of you that are listening, if this type of lecture or webinar interests you, please reach out and tell me so that if we want to continue doing something like this, I'm open to suggestions around the types of lectures and information that you'd be interested in hearing about. So I'm Audrey Esarey, and you can find me online at Cotton and Bourbon or cottonandbourbon.com. And please, let's all thank Steph for such a wonderful lecture. All right.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for having me. And if anybody is interested, you can follow us on hobbsbatting.com, or you can sign up for a newsletter there, and we don't send it out often, so we won't bombard you with emails. And also on Instagram, we're Hobbs Batting, all lowercase, all one word. And we are about to kick off a 12 days of Christmas giveaway through the month of December. So we hope you'll join us there. And again, thank you, Audrey, for having me.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you guys very much. We'll catch you next time.
All right. Good night.
Bye, everybody. Cheers.